Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for tonight's Blacklight speaker series. Tonight, we have another amazing series event for you. We have the honor of having Dr. Joseph Nelson. And Dr. Joseph Nelson is going to provide us with an amazing presentation on reimagining Black boyhood in schools and society. So we're looking forward to that. So the way tonight's presentation will flow is that there will be a moderator, and she will introduce Dr. Nelson, and then Dr. Nelson will, conduct his presentation. And then after his presentation, we will be taking question and answers. We will be taking questions, I should say, and Dr. Nelson will be answering those questions. And so please feel free, if you have any questions, to please put those in the chat. So with that, I'd like to go ahead and get started. Got a lot of great content to share with you tonight. Okay, again, thank you for taking the time to be here. And then the way we're going to start here, should have said this earlier, but just wanted to let you all know about the Blacklight speaker series. And we've actually been, we're actually going into almost 2 years that we've been presenting the series. And the series is designed to illuminate the amazing alumni at Loyola University. And the series actually got its name from the Blacklight, the actual Blacklight, which is designed to illuminate things that are hidden and not seen. And so what we found within the Black Alumni Board is that a lot of alums kind of feel that was their experience at Loyola, whereby they were at the university, but they weren't necessarily seen and getting the necessary services that they needed in order to have a better experience. So we took that information and we have designed this actual series to allow not only the university, but not only alums, but I should say the university community overall, to understand and to see what type of people that they're, producing. They're producing some amazing, alumni, and we're in the process of facilitating that so that they can understand, the university and the university community can understand what these amazing people are doing. So next, I'd like to introduce our moderator, Shakira Richards. Shakira is Vice President of Student Engagement and also Student Pipeline. So she has 2 roles on the board. She's also the Director of Program Administration for WOW, which is a youth guidance program. Shakira has multiple degrees from Loyola, and also she has degrees from Ball State, and she's also taking courses at Harvard. So with that, I'd like to introduce you to our Vice President of Student Engagement and Student Pipeline, Shakira Richards.
Thank you so much, Karen, for the wonderful introduction. I'm honored to be here today to welcome you all to the next installment of the Blacklight Speaker Series. And I'm even more honored to introduce our panelist, our speaker for today. Dr. Joseph Derrick Nelson is an Associate Professor of Educational Studies at Swarthmore College and the Chair of the Black Studies Program. He is also a Senior Research Fellow with the School Participatory Action Research Collaborative, a Race Gender Equity Institute at University of Pennsylvania. As a sociologist of education, his research primarily examines race, boyhood, and education within learning environments that largely serve Black students from neighborhoods with concentrated poverty. His multi-year projects to date have led to publications with the Teachers College Record, Harvard Education Review, and co-editing a publication, a special issue, on the Boys Education Journal with the Journal of Boyhood Studies. He recently co-edited the Routledge Handbook on Boyhood in the United States. And his forthcoming book with Harvard Education Press is entitled Reimagining Black Boyhood, Portraits of Middle School Success. In public media, his research has been featured in the Washington Post, the Atlantic, and the National Public Radio. Last year, he was named editor of the historic journal Men and Masculinities. In his hometown of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Dr. Nelson taught his first grade in a single-sex classroom of boys of color in the high poverty neighborhood where he grew up with. Something interesting and a fun fact that I would love to share with you all about Dr. Nelson is while at Loyola, Dr. Nelson was a student body president and oversaw the merger of the Water Tower and Lakeshore campus student government organizations. So he definitely left his mark here at Loyola, and I'm so honored to introduce Dr. Joseph Nelson as our featured speaker for tonight.
All right, well, good afternoon, everyone, or excuse me, good evening, everyone. I'm excited to be here with all of you, albeit virtually. And thank you, Shakira, for that very kind introduction. I'm truly honored to participate in the Blacklight Speaker Series presented by the Black Alumni Board of Loyola University Chicago. I'm a class of 2002 alum. And while at Loyola, I lived in Mertz Hall. I double majored in communications and sociology with a minor in philosophy. And I was a resident assistant, or an RA, my sophomore and junior year. And my junior year, as you heard Shakira mention, I was the president of the Lakeshore Student Government Association. And as a first generation low income student, I participated in these different aspects of campus life, all while working pretty much full time at the Gap on Michigan Avenue. So to say the least, it was a very enriching experience, but also daunting. And I look back on my time at Loyola very fondly. And so again, I'm honored to be here and be back in community with all of you. So the title of my presentation today is Reimagining Black Boyhood in Schools and Society. And at the outset of my presentations, I typically like to offer an aspiration, which is that I very much think of our time together as a partnership, as us entering this space together, bringing into it our own knowledge and expertise, and that we're in partnership together to exchange knowledge and information in the greater service of, with the focus of this presentation, supporting a reimagining of Black boyhood in schools and society. And the goal and purpose, as I see our time together, if I may, is provide a bit about who I am and my background as a university researcher, teacher educator, or scholar activist in what is often referred to as boys education. And I do want to present a reimagining of Black boyhood framework with a particular focus on educational and social policy. And then the ultimate goal is to contribute to aiding a reimagining of Black boyhood through policymaking. So what are some policy interventions that can be developed that then create spaces for Black boys to construct and experience robust childhoods? So who I am, I began my career in education as a first grade teacher on the north side of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, which is where I grew up. And it's one of the poorest and racially segregated neighborhoods for African-American families in the country. And it was at a co-ed elementary school that had a single-sex intervention for a group of primarily Black and Latino boys. So my principal at the time had asked all of the kindergarten teachers to identify students that they thought could benefit from an early intervention with respect to their academic performance or their behavior. And by default, that list came back primarily comprised of Black and Latino boys. And once it became known that I would be the teacher of this particular cohort of boys, narratives from my colleagues started to be shared with me about those boys. And things such as, this boy would never keep his hands to himself, this one you have to watch with a close eye, this one can only interact with this student. So all of these narratives started to be shared with me about the boys that I was going to teach, and even from a well-meaning place. But as you even listen to those snapshots of those narratives that were shared with me, you see clearly how they're mired in these race and gender stereotypes with respect to Black boys and men in American society. So my principal, in hiring me to teach this particular group of boys, I became, in her view, the embodiment of an intervention that was intended to, as she said, turn these boys around by third grade. So if you're an educator, or if you're familiar with American education, third grade is a key assessment year, a key year for standardized tests. And this was a period in American, or a point in the history of American education where we now refer to as the No Child Left Behind era, which is a federal legislation out of the US Department of Education that brought about increased accountability for teachers and stiffer consequences for schools that demonstrate what was referred to at the time as annual yearly progress with respect to schools or students' standardized test scores. So my charge was clear: turn them around by third grade. And if I didn't, she would initiate the special education referral process. And I even vividly remember on my very first day of teaching, in passing, she mentioned to me, "You are their last chance." So again, that was my introduction to classroom teaching. So the stakes were high. And as a first year novice teacher in a neighborhood and community where I grew up, the elementary school largely served a housing project that was right around the corner from the school where I also grew up. And so this was a school that I was familiar with from my neighborhood growing up. And clumsily, in hindsight, genuine relationships with the boys became a window into reimagining them. And what I quickly learned was through these relationships that they were so much more than, or the furthest thing from, the narratives that were shared with me about them. And in many respects, a lot of them were high performing or high achieving and disengaged really from the lackluster instruction, rote memorization, drill and skill, test prep teaching from their kindergarten classrooms, or just living up to an expectation that their teacher had of them. And even as their teacher, there was an expectation of how I was to be a teacher of them, and especially as an African-American male from that neighborhood and community. And that was one of an emphasis on quarantine and control and management of their bodies and being an authoritative teacher rather than one focused on their teaching and learning and development. And it was a school that was highly routinized. There were squares that students had to line up in the hallway. We had to walk from our classroom to the cafeteria where they had silent lunches and assigned seating in the cafeteria. And then the only time that they had in their school day to be free and play and enjoy being with one another was their 20-minute recess. And if my principal walked into my classroom, all of the students needed to be seated in their desks and they needed to be silent, because that communicated that students were on task and that they were learning. And again, clumsily in hindsight, relationships became a window into that reimagining, because what I learned quickly, in addition to the teachers who shared with me these different narratives about the boys, they also shared with me a lot of these, what was considered empirically proven instructional strategies or research-based approaches to teaching, that I quickly learned that if I didn't proceed those strategies with a relationship or approach them in a way that helped me understand how these boys thought about themselves, that I was going to be woefully unsuccessful as a classroom teacher. So the precondition needed to be a relationship before I could leverage at all any of these evidence-based instructional strategies or approaches to teaching and learning. And I now argue in my own research that when learning is the goal, with Black boys in particular, oftentimes because of how they're viewed in American society, again, largely through a rigid set of race and gender stereotypes, there needs to be some intentionality brought to relationship building. And so a lot of my research today works with teachers to help them foster positive learning relationships with Black boys in their classrooms. Because when they lead with relationship building, they begin to see Black boys having the same desires and hopes and dreams and aspirations as all children. And they quickly learn that a lot of what they've internalized from American society about who Black boys are inaccurate. And in many ways, Black boys resist and challenge a lot of these stereotypic notions of who they are. They show you who they are, and we just have to be willing to see them for who they are with all of the promise and potential and possibility that's afforded all children. But I do still recognize or want to underscore that as much as relationships are a key window into their reimagining, there's still some work too around just underscoring the importance of a reimagining of Black boyhood itself in our society, in our country, in our world. So hence I'm sharing with you all today a reimagining Black boyhood framework in the service of what schools and society can play in that endeavor. So the remarks that I'm sharing with you today actually come out of a paper that I co-authored with a colleague of mine, Michael Dumas at Berkeley, and it's entitled Reimagining Black Boyhood Toward a Critical Framework for Educational Research Policy and Practice. And it was published in the Harvard Educational Review in 2016. And I'm happy to share this with Karen and Shakira and others so that it can be disseminated and shared with you all as a reference or a resource. And I want to begin with two high-profile cases that I imagine many of you are familiar with that are what my co-author and I use as a way to legitimize the importance of a reimagining of Black boyhood. So I want to share a couple of excerpts with you to speak to the need for this reimagining. When 12-year-old Tamir Rice was shot and killed while playing in his neighborhood park, the police officer who fired the gun radioed in, shots fired, male down, Black male, maybe 20. The officer imagined the toy gun in Tamir's hand as real and a threat, at least in part because he presumed the boy to be a man with violent intent rather than a child deeply engaged in make-believe play. Similarly, neighborhood watchman George Zimmerman could not imagine Trayvon Martin as a boy who might reasonably be sauntering home, who might reasonably be frightened at being pursued by an adult. Instead, Zimmerman's defense for killing Trayvon and the public discourse surrounding the incident centered on constructing the 17-year-old as an adult man with suspect movements, threatening physicality, and malevolent intentions. And so we argue here that Black boyhood itself has been rendered both unimagined and unimaginable. For us, Black boyhood is the material and discursive social phenomenon of childhood for Black boys. Rather than a developmental phase on the way to Black manhood, Black boyhood is a social experience poetically in the now, not merely for some future existence or accomplishment, in which Black boys possess their own agental subjectivity and impact the world even as they remain vulnerable to the material effects of racism, the narrow constructions of masculinity, and the hegemonic notion that their lives as children only matter because who others want them to be or fear who they may become as an adult. Thus, to assert that Black boyhood is unimagined and unimaginable is to lament that we have created a world in which Black boys cannot be. So I want to zoom out a bit and kind of speak to American mainstream culture with respect to boyhood and Black masculinity as something that gets in our way to see Black boys as indeed children. And so there's these negative conceptions of boyhood and Black masculinity within the US context. And you see them both bulleted here. So more broadly, there's this prevailing boy code that perpetuates these qualities such as physical toughness, emotional stoicism, and independence and autonomy as who boys are and what boys should subscribe to be. But when this boy code gets compounded by racism and poverty in American society, the code takes on a hyper form. So for Black boys in particular, there's hyperaggression, anti-intellectualism, and hypersexuality become these specific norms that we associate with Black masculinity. And just to elaborate or clarify a bit, with anti-intellectualism, that's a norm of Black masculinity that's more about a recognition that formal education didn't necessarily link to better life outcomes. They were, however, very critically astute of their neighborhoods and home lives and school environments. So they were critically conscious beings in the world, but there was a general resistance or a challenging of formal education leading to better life outcomes for them. And then I want to situate this reimagining Black boyhood framework as well within a broader discourse within American society around the Black male crisis. And this Black male crisis is comprised of a set of negative social and academic outcomes associated with Black boys and men. So you see the first bullet there. In 2006, there was, for the first time ever, a front page article of the New York Times that stated, there's something very different happening with young Black men, and it's something we can no longer ignore. So in society, we see Black boys and men leading the United States in rates of homicide, suicide, and incarceration. But then within the context of schools, we see them overrepresented in suspension and expulsion rates and underrepresented in advanced placement and honors courses. And then it creates Black boys being more likely to be designated as students who have learning disabilities. So then thus placed in special education programs, as I kind of spoke to even in my own experience as a classroom teacher, teaching young Black boys in the first grade. And their placement in these special education programs are highly correlated with their dropping out of high school eventually. So it's these adverse social and academic outcomes of Black boys and men, or associated with Black boys and men, that make up this crisis rhetoric in American society that gets in our way of seeing Black boys as indeed children. It becomes a preoccupation that our focus becomes about preparing them for a world where they may indeed encounter racial and economic oppression. But a stance of the reimagining Black boyhood framework is one of the best ways to prepare Black boys for the real world that they're going to encounter, is to ensure that they get to experience a robust childhood where they're seen as children, where their perspectives and ideas and desires and hopes are valued and cared for and cultivated. When we attempt to, with good intention, really try to prepare them as best we can for what they're going to encounter, it shortchanges their experience of a childhood that we argue is critical for their ability to be resilient in later years as they encounter the racial and economic oppression that they may very well have to navigate in their adult lives. And there's a body of research that is referred to as critical childhood studies that also informs the reimagining Black boyhood framework. And the research in this area advances this idea that the meaning of childhood is always fluid, it's always shifting and responsive to culture. It's an interdisciplinary field that is intended to complement traditional notions of development or the developmental perspective, and that there's a belief that children are generally socialized by adults in their lives and by environments that they navigate. So critical childhood scholars don't deny the significance of both biological as well as psychosocial development, but they argue that children themselves are actors in those environments. They impact their own development and they impact the social world or social context that they navigate to. And so in this sense, then, critical childhood studies are a response to an overemphasis on developmentalism and progression in terms of stages and phases and natural growth, but actually prioritizes or privileges the perspectives of children and see them as valuable, are curious about what children think about the world and how their perspectives contribute to our enriching our understanding of what it means to be a human being. And oftentimes children are our most human selves. There's a growing body of research that speaks to the older boys become, the more aligned they are with the boy code and norms of Black masculinity that you heard me just speak to. So the more that we can create an experience of childhood where they hold on to their humanities, which is more varied and complex and not purely a representation of a set of race and gender stereotypes. And this too, critical childhood study, is a growing field because of, again, the overemphasis on developmentalism and children's progressing towards stages and phases of their development that privileges adulthood and preparation for adulthood rather than a preservation or creating a perspective or protective environment for their childhoods. So then, with reimagining Black boyhood and its implications for social and educational policy, here I've come to learn through my own research that there's 3 core facets of school life that are linked to society that is important for us who care about Black boys' learning and development to be mindful of. So I've learned that the aspects of school that are contributing or that are causing the most harm for Black boys fall into 3 areas. It's teachers' expectations, school discipline policy, and special education referral processes. So with teachers' expectations, there is a pattern in American society that in low-income communities of color, the teachers that are largely in those neighborhoods and communities are white middle-class women. And those white middle-class women grew up in neighborhoods that were pretty homogenous, where they had very limited interactions with people of color or individuals from different backgrounds. So then what they've internalized about Black boys has come through television, news, media, and film, which again represents these stereotypical portrayals of Black men that then create a disposition in teachers where when they view Black boys, it becomes an emphasis on quarantine, control, and management of their bodies, rather than an emphasis on their teaching and learning and development. But what I've learned through my research in coaching teachers through prioritizing relationship building with their Black boys, they quickly see how precocious and thoughtful and intelligent they are, that then their mental models of who Black boys are quickly change. And they too can see the potential and promise of what lies ahead for them when they have a good education and when they have a teacher who sees them as a child, again, with all of the potential and promise of all children. So I want to state here that rather than simply designing interventions aimed at correcting Black youth behavior or their attitudes, the first attempt should be to understand the perspectives of Black boys, so that then we gain a keener sense of their social and academic motivations, their friendship networks, their performances of race and gender. And it's the perspectives of younger Black boys in part have been largely ignored because of skepticism about whether young children are old enough to be social and cultural actors. So there's this preoccupation again with the crisis of Black manhood positions Black boyhood as irrelevant, as not important, because manhood is the goal and in preparation for a host of threats that they're going to encounter. So if educational researchers commit to a critical reimagining of Black boyhood, there could be a shift actually in public discourse about Black males overall. And this may provide the knowledge needed to support schools that not only teach Black boys well, but also are willing to learn from them and be shaped by all children. So it becomes, what can Black boys teach us about childhood? Rather than Black boys seeing as an aberration to what we consider to be a child. So again, what can Black boys teach us about boyhood, or what it means to be a child, rather than their full selves being thought of as an aberration from the norm that needs to be monitored and managed and controlled? And so I leave you with a question that becomes, or what becomes possible if we begin to see Black boys anew? As children, with all of the agency and freedom envisioned in critical notions of childhood, and without the anxiety and sense of limitation brought to bear on Black boys in educational research and everyday discourse on Black males. And so then what we suggest with a reimagining of Black boyhood is that it challenges us to think creatively about how to create and nurture spaces for Black boys so that they can self-determine and shape their own worldviews. And these spaces are equally as important for adolescent Black males. So yes, our emphasis is on childhood, but that childhood becomes an important phase of their development for adolescent and young adulthood and other phases of the life course. So indeed, a commitment to protecting young Black boyhood makes it that much easier to understand all Black youth as still vulnerable to adult repression and still worthy of spaces to just be and be in there now. So prioritizing the social, emotional, and educational needs and interests of Black boys over and above the dismal social and educational statistics about Black males shifts our attention to considering how schools can be sites of discovery and joy for Black boys. So then when we acknowledge that Black boys have legitimate fears, frustrations, and sadness about their lived experiences in school, we might challenge ourselves to think about our roles in protecting Black boys and defending them from a host of assaults on their bodies and spirits. So then schools, community centers, neighborhoods, families become places that are less concerned with, again, for instance, the disciplined control of Black male bodies, and more concerned with being places where Black boys can giggle and play and cry and pout and be just as silly and frivolous as other children without these activities being perceived as an impediment to their educational attainment or a threat to the well-being of others. And visiting schools often in the US and large urban school districts in particular, there's always these moments that I encounter where it could be a novel experiment that's happening in a first grade classroom, the very famous volcano experiment. And the volcano's in the front of the classroom, the teacher's preparing the experiment, the students are gathering around, and there's a Black boy in the class who is expressing excitement about this novel experiment that he's going to participate in. And the way he shows that excitement is through movement, through bouncing up and down a little bit in his chair, wiggling a little bit, smiling, eyes wide open. And without a reimagining of Black boyhood, that genuine interest in this experiment gets perceived as a threat. And that young boy gets moved as far away from the volcano as possible because of a threat of him tipping it over or being disruptive or blocking other students from learning that from this experiment itself. So it's these small everyday experiences in classrooms. And if there's only we can reimagine Black boyhood, we see that movement, we see that excitement as an expression of their intellectual curiosity. And then we become creative about how can we harness that energy and excitement and intellectual curiosity towards the greater good of all learning of all students in that class. So that's what the Reimagining Black Boyhood framework is about, helping teachers see Black boys anew as curious, intellectual, bright children with all the potential and promise that we know all children possess. So thank you very much.
So thank you, Dr. Nelson, for that. That was quite intriguing research. What you've come up with, I guess, probably need to introduce myself. I'm Jay Yancey, the treasurer of the Black Alumni Board at Loyola University. And I'm pleased to have this opportunity to participate and to interview you further and just to do the Q&A from the audience. Again, that was quite intriguing research and in-depth information and very eye-opening to some degree to probably most of us. You definitely take a different perspective on how we need to view Black boyhood and how we teach and connect with Black boys in school, meaning with your major focus being on relationship. So I think you definitely have struck a chord on this subject. So looking at the questions that we have at this point, one of the questions has to pertain to Black boyhood versus Black manhood. Do we need to also reimagining Black manhood given this perspective on Black boyhood?
Yes, absolutely. And there are scholars out there that are making an effort to offer up different notions of Black masculinity. And it's being framed by scholars who are looking to investigate what is now being referred to as healthy masculinities or more inclusive masculinities, so that, manhood or Black masculinity doesn't become a straitjacket that all Black boys and men have to operate within, which then doesn't reflect their full humanity. Like what I've learned from boys throughout their lives is that they resist these stereotypes constantly. They have varied interests. They like sports, they like reading, they like theater, they like law, they like debate, they like dance. And we have to kind of create a disposition in teachers, at least in my role as a teacher educator, for them to recognize that and see that. And even see that Black boys want relationships with their teachers, because they often are led to believe that they don't want the help of their teacher. They want to figure it out on their own. But what I hear overwhelmingly from boys is that they actually long for close relationships with their teachers as well, as all students do, and actually need the help of their teachers to initiate that relationship building. And even when there's conflict in those relationships, that they express wanting help from their teacher to kind of repair the relationship and help it grow, and feeling ill-equipped to do that. So, in addition to, I agree to the question, in addition to a reimagining of Black boyhood, there also is a need for a reimagining of Black manhood.
Okay, thank you. Even on that same note, another question has come through regarding Black womanhood. Does reimagining Black boyhood also impact the way we see Black womanhood?
Yes. So, well, taking one step further out. So like, I'm a sociologist by training. So we get very well versed in how institutions and societies function and operate. And one dominant kind of perspective within American society is that we live in a patriarchal society, which means that men are in positions of power and influence and control. Males are the dominant sex. And because of that, it again kind of limits who Black men and Black women can be. In some ways, what it means to be a Black man is to do everything that is not being a Black woman. But it stems from this broader kind of notion within our society of patriarchy. So it's like if we can dismantle our patriarchic values and beliefs and stances around how we govern our society, that it allows both men and women, girls and boys, and other folks who identify in other ways to be who they are. And have schools and communities and neighborhoods and families that foster their full humanity, rather than be spaces in their lives that teach them, you know, the kind of rigid ways we in society imagine who Black girls are, or Black women are, and who Black boys are, and who Black men are. So it's until we, you know, kind of reimagine patriarchy within our society, or think through ways in which we can dismantle patriarchy through our policies and practices, where all of who we are needs to be reimagined. And to underscore, in our society, we tend to gender and racialize qualities that are fundamentally human, and that then, you know, requires us to, you know, deny or downplay parts of who we are to kind of meet these norms that are incomplete and that are stereotypes, and then lead to our social problems. You know, racism, poverty, misogyny, the list goes on and on. So we're a society that genders behaviors that are fundamentally human. And if we continue to do so, we'll be a society of individuals that don't get to be their full selves. And then that's a loss for our society, because it compromises our creativity and our kind of our industriousness to create a more just and equitable world.
Wow. And it seems like what you just said, the dissertation you just gave, seems to lend itself to this other controversial thing that's going on in schools right now, which has to do with critical race theory. And what's your thought on that? Is there a relationship here with that?
Yeah, so, well, critical race theory is a theory that advances that American society historically has been built on the institution of slavery. So the American history, in many parts of its origins, is connected to slavery. And, you know, there's facets of critical race theory that speak to racial hierarchy. You know, so white people on the top of that hierarchy, Black people and other Black and brown folks on the bottom. And that we're a society that if you don't own property, that you are not a valuable citizen. And that history, in essence, is being challenged within our American educational system. And I think that, you know, there's a wonderful scholar, Nicole Hannah-Jones, in the 1619 Project, that offers a curriculum that is an honest but balanced recognition of American history, that thinks through the ways in which we can communicate that history to, you know, children and youth in schools. So the more we turn the blind eye to an honest reckoning of the history of this country, the greater we aren't able to see how, you know, some of our institutions are, you know, still racially biased. Criminal justice, even our educational system, are clearly these institutions within our society that that are causing great harm for Black and brown people currently in the US.
Yes, yes. Yeah, so we basically need a reimagining of a whole view of the society of America and all its constructs. So let me get to the next question here. This person is asking, Joshua is asking, where do you start creating your genuine connections with Black boy students, specifically when teachers are not from a similar background? So I guess from a teacher's perspective who's maybe not Black, how do they start with creating that connection probably?
Yes. So I can share with you all as well another paper that I wrote that spoke to a relational teaching framework for Black boys, or relational teaching with Black boys. It was a study that I conducted with 1,000 teachers in urban school districts in New York, Philadelphia, Houston, Atlanta, and Chicago, and then 1,500 boys in elementary and middle schools, where I asked both teachers and boys to describe for me a relationship with a teacher that was successful, but then also a relationship with the teacher where it was challenging or that they struggled. So it was an analysis across these two sets of relationships that I was able to identify a set of relational teaching strategies that largely white middle-class teachers can use as they teach in largely low-income communities of color, can use to build positive learning relationships with Black boys, mostly in elementary and middle school settings. And just to give you an example of a couple of them, one of them was I've referred to as reaching out, going beyond, meaning that a boy needed to sense from their teacher that in a moment where they're trying to be responsive to a specific learning need that that boy has, that that boy's need or that boy's personhood was seen as more important to them than, in essence, adhering to a school policy. So an example that could be if a boy stays after school for homework help, that the teacher would drive the boy to the bus stop or to the subway stop so their commute home would be quicker. Or if the teacher knows that there's a food insecurity issue at home, that they have snacks in their classroom. So to us, those seem like commonsensical things that a humane teacher would provide for their students. But if you open up the school's handbook, you'll see those behaviors listed as inappropriate or out of bounds, so to speak. But boys, when they recognize that their teachers reached out and went beyond in these ways for them, it really helped cultivate a positive learning relationship between the two of them. Another one was establishing common ground. So a little gesture of teachers just seeing where they have similar interests or talents or abilities as the boys. It could be something as simple as having the same Apple Watch, enjoying the same television show, having the same Timberland boots, watching the same athletic game or award show. If these simple gestures for boys went to great lengths for them to be able to see themselves in their teachers and for their teachers to be able to see themselves in the Black boys in their classroom. So I just offer those two quick examples of relational teaching strategies that I've done professional development with teachers on about how to build those positive learning relationships.
Okay. And even on that question, I know one of the questions in the chat and the Q&A kind of leads to this as well. That your answer is, how is Black boyhood so different than white boyhood? Is there really a difference, or is it just a perspective or a societal view that they're so different?
Well, there are cultural differences for people who are from the African diaspora. And there's culture that's Eurocentric. And I think there are some differences. But I also think that because we live in American society that has a kind of a history of racial and economic oppression, it creates not an essence of Black boyhood, but neighborhoods and communities and experiences that are likely more to be experienced by Black boys. So it's raising an awareness of teachers of what they're likely to encounter given the neighborhoods and communities and contexts in which we often find Black boys and men growing up. And it's, at least from my perspective, it situates the Black male crisis not within boys themselves, but actually within their the environments or neighborhoods or school contexts that they environment. So how can we change the neighborhoods and schools that Black boys go to rather than boys themselves? Because then if you situate the problem within Black boys, the solution becomes different than if you situate the problem within their neighborhood or school environment. If you situate the problem within the boy as if there's something wrong with the boy, you suspend and expel them, or you sign them up for special education services. But if you think, if you view it as the neighborhood or school and environment as what can we do to support Black boys better in light of their experiences in the US, it becomes, how can I be more creative in my instruction? How can I be more intentional about my relationship building? How can I advocate for resources in my school that are needed for the students that we serve? The children and boys themselves are whole beings, but we as educators use our creativity and our professional skill to think about how we can change our instruction and change our schools and classrooms to serve Black boys better.
Okay, excellent, excellent. And on that note, you mentioned special education. And so one of the questions coming in from Megan Press has to do with special education. And her question is, has your research noted that in predominantly white areas, is there overrepresentation of Black students recommended for special education? And then also on the flip side, in Black neighborhoods, predominantly with a Black population, do you find that the Black boys or kids in that school have an underrepresentation of special education? Is there a vast difference between the two?
So right now, one of the institutes that gets cited a lot for special education research and on Black boys in particular comes out of New York University. And they have the Metropolitan Center for Urban Education. And they have a research arm within the Metro Center that is called TAC-D, which is their technical assistance for disproportionality. So in the state of New York, there's data that's collected on school districts that determines to what extent they're operating in disproportionate ways, and that they're referring more Black boys for special education services than other students. And it's pretty consistent with in white suburbs where Black boys are in the minority, and in largely communities of color or schools of color, that the proportion of students being disproportionately kind of diagnosed as students with special needs is pretty comparable. So maybe if anything, there's slightly more just because of the environment of them being in the minority, them being in special ed. And I will say too, as a classroom teacher, all 17 of the boys that I taught had an IEP, which is an individualized education plan that is the result of a host of diagnostics that Black boys had to undergo to determine what their special needs were. And it was formalized in a document that is an individualized education plan. And I think it's no mistake that those instruments that used to evaluate and to diagnose boys as having special needs are biased in some ways, or are influenced by these race and gender stereotypes of Black boys, or an overemphasis on managing and control and anxieties and fears about how they might show up in your classroom, rather than a real evidence of a special need being there.
This is probably going to have to be the last question. And I'm going to try to combine two questions in one here because they're kind of similar or on the same vein. So Michelle Slavin and Josh Miller basically kind of have a similar question. So Michelle is a teacher at a predominantly Black school district in Philadelphia. Mm-hmm. And she's really been intrigued by your presentation and thinks that it could be very helpful for her school district. So she wants to know, how do you provide ongoing training and teaching for teachers? If so, how would you go about scheduling that? And then Josh wants to know what policy change could help with this, and in terms of teachers, coaches, and mentors, how to have a positive impact on both Black boys, but also help other mentor teachers, and so on and so forth. So that's the gist of it. How do we help teachers and mentors with this reimagining of Black boyhood, and how to reach them and teach them?
Great. So in Philadelphia, I have a partnership with the Urban Teacher Residency Program at Temple University. So on an annual basis in their teacher ed program, I lead a 4-part workshop with teachers around relational teaching with Black boys. And I wanted to partner with Temple's teacher ed program because they are the largest feeder of classroom teachers to the school district of Philadelphia schools. So it's my way to contribute to a new generation of teachers in at least Philadelphia that are more relational in their teaching practice with Black boys. So they too can build those relationships that help them reimagine who those Black boys are. And similar partnerships in New York City with schools there as well in a similar type of capacity. In New York City, it's Hunter College, which is known to be the largest feeder of teachers in the New York City Department of Education. So Hunter College's School of Education. And to the policy question, I think right now, the Metropolitan Center for Urban Education at New York University is conducting another study that's looking at the universal pre-K programs in New York City and in other large school districts. And they're finding that there's a disproportionate number of Black boys being suspended and expelled from those universal pre-K programs. And if there's a policy change that could ever be needed, is taking away suspension and expulsion as an option for preschool teachers in their interactions with all children, but especially Black boys, given the history of kind of disproportionality in school discipline policy. So if there's any school discipline policy we can change, and we're trying to lobby for it through this, the New York State Regents or the New York State Board of Education, is taking away suspension and expulsion as an option, or figuring out ways to not over rely on those two discipline policies as how we address Black boys kind of showing up in their classrooms. So I think it's those policies that are creating the most harm. And if we can change those, we're forced to be more creative about how to see boys' humanity in our schools and classrooms, from preschool, elementary school, and onward.
Okay, yes, because it seems, based on your question a little earlier about the research that showed that there wasn't much difference between boys in Black neighborhoods versus white neighborhoods being recommended for special education. So it's not per se the teachers, white versus Black, or so on and so forth. It's more the policy and the structure that kind of is driving the young men into these special education, classes, and not really seeing them for who they really are. So, yeah.
Also teacher development as well. I think teacher ed, we can do better at preparing teachers for, I think our even how we teach teachers is formulaic and rigid and doesn't account for who, children and youth are. And then as a result, there's anxieties or fears that get in our way of being effective teachers. And then it causes us to misstep. The knee jerk is to suspend or expel, rather than what is this child's behavior communicating to me that is a met or unmet need. So leading with the child's behavior is communicating to me a need that they have, rather than a problem with them. And then how can I be creative as a teacher in my classroom to meet that learning need? That's the shift I think we need to be better at training teachers for in their preparation.
Okay, excellent, excellent. I know we said no more questions, but Megan is begging for me to ask this question, and it seems that you kind of just spoke to it. She's saying that should we be looking at restorative justice as an alternative to suspension and expulsion?
Yeah, so restorative justice is one approach to reimagining, and I don't even think school discipline is the right term, but how to create community within a school environment where children and teachers are held accountable for their actions and behaviors that create a community. So I do see restorative justice as an approach to building community that is that's less punitive and more about cultivating relationships and building community and connection, so good learning and development can happen.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Nelson. This has been Excellent and very eye-opening and very inspiring. And I know you got a book coming out, so everybody look out for Dr. Nelson's book, who's going to probably expound and give us even more detail. And I know I'm being asked to close out, so I'm going to bring you our president now, Karen Fleshman. Again, thank you, Dr. Nelson.
Thank you, everyone. And if there's any other way that I can be of support to you all, definitely feel free to reach out.
Okay.
Absolutely, we will. Dr. Nelson, your work is phenomenal. Just listening to you has been, incredible. We want to thank you so much for sharing your expertise and your research. It has the ability to change the education system. And it sounds like, as you talk about the various school systems that you've been involved in, that, the breadth of your work is actually being experienced by a lot of schools and teachers as well. So it's impressive. It's very impressive. And we want to thank you again for, agreeing to, be a featured speaker at the Blacklight Speaker Series. We really appreciate all of this. And for me, my takeaway is, that early childhood is all about expectations, right? So if if people in authority, teachers, police officers, whoever they are, if they have low expectations, they're going to get low results. And so I think it all kind of starts there. But again, want to thank you for your time and really appreciate this, a phenomenal presentation that you gave us tonight. A lot of new information, a lot of very constructive information and a lot of actionable information as well. So thank you again, Dr. Nelson.
Thank you. I appreciate it, Karen.
Okay, so we're actually well over time. So within the series, we try to stay within our allotted time. So with that, I'm just going to thank everyone for joining us tonight. I think that we needed to extend this conversation because it's just so important and so impactful. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us tonight. I hope you learned as much as and are excited about Dr. Nelson's work as I am. And yeah, we'll have to bring you back, Dr. Nelson, because I know there's just so much more that you can share with us. So with that, I'd like to say thank you all for coming tonight. And, please join us for more Blacklight Speaker Series. Our next event will be in July, and it will be our own Executive Vice President, Flex Omar. He will be the featured speaker during that July session. So with that, everyone have a great evening. And again, thank you all for coming tonight.